Hello guys, welcome to the part 2 of the basics which is dealing with systems. So let's go into the course. First of all, before going into systems, we wish to I wish to say something about signals more, two things, which is signal transformation and some of the elementary functions we'll be seeing throughout the course. We introduce that here. So the first is signal transformation. I'll say this with, first of all, let's go to continuous time and see how can we transform signals there. So there are actually three types of signal transformations we can do. First thing is time shifting. You have a curve, you have a signal, you can time shift it either by plus t or minus t, so that will correspond to moving the entire signal function along the x-axis as many steps as you wish. That is actually corresponding to the time shifting. The next type of transformation you can do is time scaling. Spread out the x-axis according to whether a is greater than 1 or less than 1, and that is one kind of operation you can do on signals, that is called time scaling. And if suppose in the same time scaling case, if a becomes minus 1, then it's called time reversal. What happens is the entire signal function gets reversed about the y-axis, and that is one kind of transformation you can do. This is actually a special case of time scaling. So third type you can do is called amplitude scaling, where you deal with the amplitudes, and this I've mentioned here is actually called amplitude reversing. The more general word is if x of t becomes a times x of t, that is called actually amplitude scaling. And these are actually the basic signal transformations you can do. And I would like to a concrete example of these three combined together, and one is shown here as shown here. So basically the aim is like you've given a signal x of t like this, which is actually let's say this amplitude is 1, and it is 1 when x of t goes from minus 1 to 1 and is 0 otherwise. So you wish to perform a certain transformation where you wish to obtain a signal x of twice of t plus 3. This is a signal you wish to obtain by transforming this signal somehow. So the aim is to draw a graph of the corresponding new signal. So there are actually two ways to do this, and I'll show you what are the differences there. First of all, let's be very clear what is our aim. Here this graph corresponds to x of t, and the independent variable is t here. So it shows that for a corresponding t1, let's say t is equal to 1, we get a corresponding x of 1 value. So if we wish to draw the graph of x of 2t plus 3, then we wish to find such a input value which will, if you input 1 to this, if you put such a value of t to this, then this entire argument will become 1, and only that value will correspond to x of 1 being 1. So we wish to find out what argument should be given to t so as to make this entire argument as the corresponding t. So first of all, what you have to do is you have to shift by minus 3, because you have to transpose this equation here. So it will become, let's say it's t dash is equal to 2t plus 3, then t is minus 3. So you have to shift t minus 3 will become, so we have to shift by minus 3. So it will become minus 4 and minus 2. Then you have to scale, since it's 2 here, you have to scale by 0.5. So because like you have to take this down to the other side, so it will become 1 by 2 is 0.5, so you have to scale by 0.5. This is one way of doing it. So while if suppose let's say it's at plus x, at plus b, then you have to shift by b, only then scale by a. That's the rule, and it's actually into 2. And the other way is actually you could take 2 common out, like you can say 2 times of t plus 1.5, that you can say. And then what we will do is first you have to scale by 0.5, because when it is this side, when it's in this form, when you take the rearrange the terms to the other side, you will only take 2 to the other side first, only then you will take 1.5. So you have to you have to scale it by 0.5, so it will become squished. Then you have to shift it by minus 1.5, so this will become shifted like this. And the beauty here is in either way you have to obtain the same answer, because essentially what you're doing is basically you're transforming this x of t to x of 2t plus 3, which is same here also. So you have to get the same answer here. That is actually two ways of doing it. And if this is clear, I think the entire concept will be clear. So then we'll go to time scaling in discrete time. It's actually quite complicated here. It's not as straightforward as in continuous time. So the problem here is actually the key behind difference between these two is that the argument of a discrete time sequence should be an integer. That's the only catch. So let's say time shifting is basically the same in both continuous time and discrete time. It doesn't matter much. But in case of discrete time, you have x of n goes to x of a star n. So given the initial sequence x of n, you have to form a new sequence x of a n. This is actually we get that by transforming this somehow. So the difference here is actually let's say if a is greater than 1, let's say it's 2n. So the point here is, if let's say they give a time sequence for x of n, you have to form x of 2n. So let's define a new time sequence phi of n, which is actually equal to x of 2n. So if you look at the values of phi of 1, phi of 2, all those things, you'll only be taking the corresponding values in x sequence as x of 2, x of 4, x of 6, etc. So you are basically throwing out some data from the original sequence, like you are actually shrinking your database. So that is actually one point to notice when a is greater than 1 in time scaling. And the other thing actually happens in when a is less than 1. Let's say you are given x of n, the sequence, and you wish to form x of n by 3, let's say. Then when you define a new sequence called phi of n, which is actually equal to x of n by 3, then what happens is, if you look at the values corresponding to phi of 1, phi of 2, phi of 3, all those things, phi of 1 is actually equivalent to x of 1 by 3. But this 1 by 3, the argument part, cannot be a fractional part. It has to be an integer. It cannot be a fraction or rational number also. So that is the point. So you have to miss out 1 by 3, you have to miss out 1, 2, and you have to straightly go to 3. So only then that will correspond to x of 1. So it's basically like spreading out the sequence and leaving gaps in between the like in the resulting sequence. You leave gaps in the resulting signal. So how do we fill that gaps? That can be filled using interpolation. So this is the key concepts in, like, while you deal with time scaling in discrete time. So then let's move on to elementary functions. It's actually crucial functions that will be helpful throughout the course, just compiling them. So the first, actually we'll look at only two functions here. The two functions are unit step and unit impulse. So this unit step is actually defined for both continuous time and discrete time, that slightly differs. Like this CT for continuous time, the unit step function is defined as, it is 0 for all t less than 0, and it is 1 for all t greater than 0. Not exactly defined at t is equal to 0, so not exactly a function. And the corresponding discrete counterpart is defined as u of n, and here it's 0 for all n less than 0, and it is 1 for all n greater than or equal to 0. So that satisfies the next function is unit impulse function. Actually it's quite difficult to define the continuous time part of it. So like first we'll define the discrete time part of it. So it's actually defined as it's actually called delta of n, and this delta of n is actually 0 everywhere except 0, and it is 1 at exactly 0 at n is equal to 0. This is how this unit impulse function is. And in continuous time, actually, like first of all, let me try to define this. It is actually 0 for all t except t equals 0, and the integral of this along the entire region is equal to 1. So this is how delta of t is defined. But this will become more clear once we see what's the relation between this impulse function and the step function, and once you compare the analysis of the discrete and its counterpart of continuous, then you will get a better understanding. So the relation is actually like this. Let's first look at the discrete part. The unit impulse function is the first difference of unit step function. Like the first difference is actually a discrete way of saying a first derivative. So this delta of n is actually equal to u of n minus u of n minus 1. So by this way, if you look at the unit step function of discrete time, so if you take the continuous difference of all these things, it will become 0 everywhere, and only at 0 it will become 1, because 1 minus 0 is 1, and it will again become 0 everywhere. So the change is happening only at 0. So that is the only reason why this delta of n is 1 at 0 only and 0 everywhere. That is the logic. And similarly, if you wish to derive unit step function from the unit impulse function, then you have to take a running sum. Like you have to, like, let's say you wish to know what's the value of unit step function at n. You have to sum up from minus infinity till point n of all the values of delta n. So delta m. So then you will get that corresponding value of u of n. So this is how they are interrelated. And if you wish to draw a similar analogy to this unit impulse for the continuous time part as well, then you will get this. The unit impulse function is the first derivative of unit step function. So you take this unit step function, and it's actually the derivative is 0 for all t less than 0, and it is always it's again 0 for all t greater than 0. So that is why these two parts are explained by this way. And at t is equal to 0, what happens is, in a very small interval of time, like negligibly small interval of time, this u of t jumps from 0 to 1. This is the point. So like it's like, the difference is constant, 1 minus 0 is 1, but the time taken to achieve this is negligibly small, that this nearly becomes vertical and the slope becomes infinity. almost, and it becomes like this. One point to note here is this one does not refer to the value of the function at this point. It just refers to the fact that if you integrate over the entire region of sum, then you'll region of interval, then you'll get 1 as your answer. And this is actually the relation between in the continuous time. And one thing to note here is, like, if you wish to get the unit impulse step function from the unit impulse function, then you will have to integrate this impulse function till the point where you wish to attain the value of step function. So, like, one more thing to note here is, uh, yeah, if you put t for any value of t less than 0, this spike will not be covered in this region of integration. So anyways, you won't get a 1, and once you cross this, you'll always get this spike, so you'll always get 1, and that is why this function looks like this. Yeah, so now we'll go to systems. Like, we have studied enough of signals, so then actually we'll be dealing with how to classify systems. And there are actually 5 major categories in which you can classify signals, on the characteristics on which you can classify systems. So the first one is based on memory. So there are two types of systems: with memory and memoryless systems. Actually, let's understand what is the concept of memory in this course. Like, memory corresponds to the presence of a mechanism in the system that retains the information about the input values, not just on this time but on any time. You consider an example of a capacitor circuit with a resistor and a battery. So this capacitor actually has some way of storing energy. Whatever energy you give to it, it has some capacity to store this. So what happens is, that is actually an indicator of memory. So whenever there is memory in a physical system, it means that there is some way of storing energy associated with the system in physical form. So that is actually the concept. And you could also wonder, how can someone have memory of future? That happens when the independent variable is not time. Instead, it is some, x-axis. Like, let's say we are dealing with a image recognition software where there's actually the x-axis is there, and you wish to take a moving average of the pixels value, like, let's say a red value of the pixel. Then you would actually wish to know what is in front of it. Like, that also has to be known. So that way you could see memory can be associated with future inputs also. And when you come to memoryless systems, actually, it's actually the opposite. The output of each value is independent of the previous and past inputs. It's only dependent on the input at the same time. So obviously you should have future memory also. These are examples of memoryless systems. And then we go to invertibility of a system. This property actually corresponds to uh, being able to guess the input function just by looking at the output function. That is actually in plain terms. So that actually, mathematically, if you wish to say, like, distinct inputs should lead to distinct outputs, and you should have an inverse system which is capable of converting this y of n back to x of n, like to the original form. That is actually called invertibility. And then comes causality. We saw causal signals. Like, this is actually quite different, but it's actually related in some way, which you'll get to know in future parts. So the point here is, the output at any time depends only on the values of input at the present time and in the past, not on future. That's how we define causality. And by future, I mean, I've explained you earlier. And this is called actually a non-anticipative system. This means that it is not anticipating the future values. It just, like, it does all its work with past and present values. And obviously all memoryless systems are causal, because anyway there is no memory associated with it, so neither the future of it, neither future memories. And actually it's quite tricky here. The like, if you see causal systems example, this is actually pretty straightforward. You have y of n minus y of n minus 1, and y of n is actually present, and this is actually a past input, so there is it's no way it could be non-causal. So this is done. If you look at this one, y of n is x of minus n. You may say minus n is again something related to past, so this could also be falling under causal system. It's marked under non-causal. It's because you have to look for all inputs actually, not just for ones seems to be positive. So if you give a negative input for y of n here, like for n, like let's say n is minus 5, then y of minus 5 is actually equal to x of 5, which means that for deciding an input, deciding an output, you need to know the previous, like, future inputs. Like, if you give n is minus 5, this x of, you need to know what is the value of x of 5 to decide the value of y of minus 5. So it's obviously non-causal. It's actually anticipative, so it's not causal. Then coming to this, actually, like, you have a function y of t equals x of t cos of t plus 1. It corresponds to a system which transform x of t into y of t based on this equation. So you may say it's again non-causal because it's t plus 1, but it's not the case so, because you have to look at only the properties of signals, not of system, because this signal should this output signal should not depend on the future values of the input signal, but there is no condition on the characteristics of the system. It's system, it's more inherent to the system. This is not our case. We have to look at only this signal, so that way it actually falls under causal. And then we deal with stability. It's actually more familiar. A stable system is one which where you give small inputs that leads to responses that do not diverge, like, so that is actually is called a stable system. And more formal way of putting it is, let's say you give an input signal x of t to a system is actually bounded by a non arbitrary positive number called b. Then you must always get another output that is actually bounded by some other number. It cannot, you cannot give a finite input and get an infinite output. That is actually not possible when the system is stable. That's all about stability. This is actually called BIBO stability. It's actually bounded input bounded output stability. Let's go to time invariance. It's actually more important. The other two I'm going to discuss now. Time invariance is basically saying that the behavior and the characteristics of the system is actually fixed over time. That is actually not variant. That is what essentially mean by time variant. And one important characteristic you can note about time invariant systems are, if you time shift the input signal by some amount, then it results in an identical time shift in the output signal also. It's because since it's actually time invariant, so it should not depend on time, so it doesn't matter when you give this input signal. Time shifting does simply means that you're giving the input signal at a past time or at a future time. So since a system is time invariant, that shouldn't matter to the system. It should give the same output in a at any time you give the input, so provided the input is same. So that is why it results in identical time shift. And if you look at these two systems, I've given a counter examples of them, and this actually leads to a time variant, because here you have n of x of n. You give x of n minus, let's say, n naught, then this would result in a it would not result in a again identical time shift in the output signal, because that would correspond to n minus n naught times x of n minus n naught. That is actually not the same. So that is actually not a time invariant system, and similarly goes to this. You can reason the same way. So this time invariant is an important property which we'll be dealing with through the course. And this time invariant is actually not obviously very common in everywhere, but we can just take some systems, and at least where we wish to observe the system, at least for that much time, if it's time invariant, then it's fine for us. So that's why we are developing a methodology for this. And then we go to linearity. And a system is called linear if it possesses this property of called superposition. So the superposition property means, like, if you give an input which consists of weighted sum of several signals, then the output should also be the weighted sum of responsive system to each of the signals individually. That is called superposition basically. And there are two aspects to it. One is called additivity and homogeneity. And by additivity you mean that if you give x of 1 plus x of 2 and each of them individually produce y of 1 y of 2, then if you combine them, the results also will combine, like it should give y of 1 plus y of 2. And a homogeneity is basically the scaling factor. Like if you give ax1, then the output also should correspondingly scale. It should give a y1. So these are the defining equations mathematically put for continuous time and discrete time, and where a can be a complex scalar, that is to be noted. So these are the important properties that will be like systems based on which you can classify them. And this time invariance and linearity actually very important, that our next part will be itself be based on these two, linearly time invariant systems. Yeah, then thank you.